They said a man who gives away his only horse is already digging his own grave. And Ethan Caldwell knew that was true the moment his fingers loosened from the reins and the animal stepped away from him, carrying a stranger's fate into the dust. The sun hung low over the dry plains, painting everything in slow-burning gold, and the wind carried the scent of leather, heat, and something unsettled, something waiting. As Ethan stood there with empty hands where his whole life had been just seconds before, because out here a horse wasn't just a way to travel, it was water, shelter, distance, survival, and without it a man measured the world in miles he might never finish walking. The girl hadn't looked like trouble, not the kind folks warn about in saloons or whisper about at night. She looked like someone running out of time, boots worn thin, breath uneven, eyes locked on that horse like it wasn't a request but a last chance. And when she spoke it wasn't loud or desperate, just steady. Enough to cut through the wind, asking for something no one in their right mind would give. And maybe that's why Ethan didn't ask questions, didn't look for reasons, because reasons belong to safer places than this. Places where people had the luxury to hesitate. A man leaning against the hitching post nearby let out a dry laugh, said giving up that horse meant Ethan wouldn't make it past nightfall, said it like he'd seen it happen before, like it was already written, but Ethan didn't turn his head, didn't offer a word back, just rested his palm against the horse's neck one last time, feeling the warmth, the quiet trust, then passed the reins forward as if he were handing over something lighter than it was. The girl hesitated for half a heartbeat, like she hadn't expected the world to answer her so easily. Then she climbed up and rode hard, dust rising behind her in a long fading line until even the sound of hooves disappeared into the open land. Silence came back slow, settling over everything, and Ethan stood there, boots planted in the dirt, watching nothing where everything had just been, feeling the weight of the choice not in regret, but in the space it left behind. Somewhere far off a hawk circled, the kind that knows when something is about to change, and the man at the post shook his head, muttering that no good ever came from trusting strangers. But Ethan finally moved, turning away from the road with the same steady pace he always had, as if the ground beneath him hadn't just shifted. The wind picked up again, carrying faint echoes from the distance. Not voices, not yet, but something that didn't belong to emptiness. And though Ethan didn't look back, something in the way the horizon held its breath suggested that what he had given away in silence hadn't disappeared at all. It had only begun its journey back to him in a form no one standing there could have imagined. Ethan Caldwell walked until the sun slipped behind the low hills and the heat bled out of the ground, leaving the air thin and restless, and every step without a horse felt heavier than the last. Not because of distance, but because of what distance meant now. Miles stretching longer when you had to earn each one with your own breath, and still he did not rush, did not look over his shoulder. Because a man who starts second-guessing a choice like that never really stops. The road bent past a dry creek bed where the earth cracked like old leather, and he crouched there for a moment, running his fingers through the dust as if it might tell him something. But the land kept its silence the way it always did, offering nothing and expecting everything in return. And somewhere in that quiet he heard it again, faint at first, like a memory that had not decided whether to stay or go. A distant rhythm that did not belong to wind or birds or the shifting of sand. He stood slowly, eyes narrowing, toward the horizon where the light had turned to deep copper, and the sound came clearer then, not loud, not urgent, just steady, like something moving with purpose instead of panic. And that was what unsettled him more than anything. Because out here people either ran from something or chased something. But this sound felt like neither. It felt like it already knew where it was going. Ethan adjusted the worn strap on his shoulder, the one that used to sit easy when he rode instead of walked, and kept moving, 1 mile blending into the next until the first stars began to show, cold and distant above him. And still that rhythm followed, never close enough to see, never far enough to forget. He passed an old fence line leaning at odd angles, posts half swallowed by the earth, and for a moment he paused there, resting his hand against the rough wood, feeling the age in it, the years of wind and weather. And he wondered how many men had stood in this same spot thinking they understood the land, thinking they had it measured, only to realize too late that the land was always measuring them instead. The sound grew just enough to carry a shape now, more than one set of hooves, more than a single rider, and Ethan exhaled slowly, not in fear, not in relief, just in acceptance, because whatever was coming had already decided to find him long before he gave that horse away. The night settled deeper, wrapping the plains in a kind of stillness that pressed against the ears. And when he finally reached a small rise overlooking the open stretch ahead, he stopped, not because he was tired, but because something in the air had changed again, heavier now, charged in a way that made the silence feel like it was waiting for permission to break. And far out in the darkness, just at the edge where sight began to fail, shadows moved in a line too organized to be chance, too deliberate to be ignored, and Ethan Caldwell, standing alone without the one thing that had ever kept distance on his side, realized that the choice he made hours ago was no longer behind him. It was catching up, step by step, with a certainty that no man could outrun. The figures did not rush him, and that was the first thing Ethan Caldwell noticed as the line of riders slowly revealed itself against the dim horizon, their movement steady, controlled, as if the night itself had agreed to carry them forward without resistance, and the sound of hooves that had followed him for miles now settled into a quiet rhythm that no longer hid its presence. He stood where the ground rose slightly beneath his boots, the wind brushing past his coat, bringing with it the scent of horses, leather, and distant fire. And for a long moment no one spoke, no one called out, because whatever this was, it did not begin with words. The riders came closer until shapes turned into men, until shadows became faces, until the silence between them held more weight than any question could, and Ethan did not reach for anything, did not shift his stance. He simply waited the way a man waits when he understands that moving too soon would only disturb something already decided. Then from the center of that formation, one rider stepped forward, the horse moving with a calm that spoke of long miles and longer discipline. And even before the light caught her face, Ethan knew, not by sight, but by the way the air changed around her, by the way the others gave space without being told, that she was the reason all of this had come to him. Eliza Ward guided the horse to a stop just a few yards away, and Ash lowered its head slightly as if it recognized the man it had left behind, the leather reins hanging loose, untouched by force, untouched by fear. And for a brief second something like relief flickered across Ethan's face, not for himself, but for the simple fact that the animal had returned unharmed, because out here that alone was never guaranteed. Eliza studied him in silence, her expression no longer frantic, no longer pressed by urgency, but steadied by something deeper, something that had settled into her since she rode away. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried clear in the open air, not loud, not soft, just certain, and she said his name like she had known it long before this night. Ethan Caldwell, as if the land itself had told her, and behind her the riders remained still, watching, not with suspicion, not with threat, but with a quiet attention that felt almost like respect waiting to be earned. Ethan tilted his head slightly, not in confusion but in acknowledgement, because hearing his name from a stranger did not surprise him as much as it should have, not after everything that had already unfolded, and his eyes moved past her for a moment, counting without meaning to 1, 5, 10, more than that, enough to turn a simple encounter into something else entirely. The night seemed to hold its breath again as Eliza reached down and lifted the reins, extending them toward him without stepping closer, leaving that final distance between them untouched, and it was in that space, no more than a few feet of empty ground, that something unspoken settled, something that had nothing to do with the horse and everything to do with the choice that had started this. And Ethan did not take the reins immediately, not because he hesitated, but because in that quiet moment, he understood that what stood in front of him was no longer just a girl who had asked for help. It was the beginning of an answer he had not yet fully seen, and somewhere beyond the line of riders, beyond the reach of sight, the faint glow of distant fires hinted that whatever journey she had taken with his horse had not ended when she turned back. It had only revealed the first part of something far larger, now waiting in the dark. The reins hung between them like a question that neither of them rushed to answer, and Ethan Caldwell finally reached out, not with urgency, but with the same steady calm that had defined him since the beginning, his fingers closing around the worn leather as Ash shifted its weight slightly, recognizing the touch it had known for years, and for a brief moment the world narrowed to that simple contact, man and horse. Something returned that should never have left. Eliza Ward did not let go. Immediately, her hand still holding the other end, her eyes fixed on his, not with gratitude alone, but with something heavier, something earned, and when she released it, it was slow, deliberate, as if the act itself carried meaning beyond the exchange. The riders behind her remained silent, their presence no longer a threat, but not entirely understood either, a quiet force that filled the night with expectation instead of fear. And Ethan studied them again, noticing details now that had not been clear before. The way their horses stood calm despite the long ride, the way their posture held discipline without tension, the way no one reached for anything unnecessary, as if they had come not to take but to witness. Eliza stepped down from the saddle then, her boots touching the ground with a softness that did not match the urgency she had carried hours before, and for the first time since she appeared, she seemed smaller, not weaker, but human in a way that distance had hidden, and she took a single step closer, just enough to close part of the space between them while still leaving room for choice. "You gave me time," she said, her voice steady but lower now, shaped by something that had settled inside her since the ride, time that no one else would have given. And Ethan listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, because out here explanations often came too late to matter. But this one felt different, not like justification, more like a piece of something larger being placed carefully where it belonged. She turned slightly then, gesturing toward the line of riders, and though no one moved, the meaning was clear. They had followed not because they were called, but because what she had done mattered enough to be seen, and somewhere beyond them the faint glow Ethan had noticed before burned a little brighter, firelight flickering against the horizon in a way that suggested not destruction but gathering. People drawn together for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The wind shifted again, carrying with it distant voices, low and indistinct, and Ethan realized then that whatever she had reached in her journey had not been empty land. It had been others, waiting, needing, holding on to something that might have slipped away if she had arrived even a little too late. He glanced back at her, then at the riders, then at the open land beyond, and for a man who had lived most of his life alone, the presence of so many without a single raised voice felt almost unreal, like stepping into a story that had already begun before he arrived. Eliza watched him carefully, as if measuring whether he understood without needing to be told, and when she spoke again, there was no rush in it, no attempt to convince, only quiet truth. "There are people out there who are alive tonight because you did not ask me why," and the words settled into the space between them without echo, without demand, simply existing the way truth does when it no longer needs to prove itself. And Ethan Caldwell, standing with the reins of his returned horse in his hand, realized that the night had not brought back what he had given away. It had brought back the reason he had given it in the first place, even if he had not known it at the time. The words did not echo, they settled, and that was what made them heavier than anything spoken louder could have been. And Ethan Caldwell stood there with the reins resting loosely in his hand, the leather warm from another rider's grip, while the meaning behind what Eliza Ward had said moved slower, deeper, like something finding its place inside him without asking permission. He did not nod, did not offer thanks, because men like him had learned long ago that some things were not meant to be answered out loud. And instead he turned slightly, his hand brushing along Ash's neck again, grounding himself in something familiar while the unfamiliar gathered all around him. The riders behind her shifted just enough to signal a change without breaking their silence. A subtle movement of horses adjusting stance, of figures straightening in their saddles, and for the first time since they arrived, the formation loosened, not dispersing, but opening, like a door left unlatched rather than forced wide. Eliza noticed it too, her gaze flicking briefly over her shoulder before returning to Ethan, and there was a question in her eyes now, not spoken, not demanded, but offered the same way she had taken the horse, directly and without disguise. The distant firelight grew stronger, no longer a suggestion but a presence, flickering against the low sky in uneven pulses that hinted at more than a single flame. And with it came the faint murmur of voices carried on the wind, not sharp enough to distinguish words, but steady enough to tell of people gathered, waiting, holding on to something that had not yet been decided. Ethan shifted his weight, boots pressing into the dry earth as he looked past her toward that glow. And for a man who had spent years choosing distance over involvement, the idea of stepping closer to something like that did not come easy, but neither did walking away from something already set in motion. Ash exhaled softly, the sound low and familiar, and Ethan rested his forehead briefly against the horse's mane, not out of weakness but out of habit, the kind that comes from years of speaking without words. And when he lifted his head again, his eyes were no longer measuring escape, they were measuring direction. Eliza did not smile, did not thank him again. She simply stepped aside, leaving a clear path between him and the riders, between him and whatever waited beyond them. And that small movement carried more invitation than any spoken request. The night seemed to widen, the silence stretching just enough to make room for a decision that no one else could make for him. And one by one the riders began to turn their horses, not riding off, but aligning themselves toward the distant fires, as if the path had already been chosen and all that remained was whether he would follow. Ethan Caldwell stood still for a moment longer, the weight of the reins in his hand, reminding him of what had been given and what had been returned, and then, without a word, without a glance back at the empty road behind him, he placed his foot in the stirrup and pulled himself into the saddle, the motion smooth, practiced, final in a way that left no room for doubt. The horse shifted beneath him, ready, and ahead. The riders moved as one, not hurried, not hesitant, carrying him toward a place he had never intended to go, toward people he had never planned to meet, and toward an answer that had started long before he ever knew the question existed. The line of riders moved like a single thought across the open land, not fast, not slow, just certain, and Ethan Caldwell rode among them without trying to match their rhythm, because it came naturally the longer he stayed, as if the silence between them carried instructions that no one needed to speak. The night stretched wide above, stars sharp and cold, and the ground beneath the horses softened with distance, dust giving way to patches of dry grass that whispered under hoofbeats. And ahead, the firelight grew larger, no longer distant or abstract, but real enough to cast shadows that flickered and shifted against low shapes on the horizon. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as details began to form, outlines of wagons, canvas stretched tight against wooden frames, and figures moving slowly between them, not in panic, not in disorder, but with the careful motion of people holding on to what they had left. Eliza Ward rode a few lengths ahead now, no longer needing to look back, because she knew he had followed, and the riders around them adjusted without breaking formation, creating space not out of distance but out of quiet respect for something that had already been decided between two people without witnesses. As they drew closer, the sounds changed. The low murmur of voices became clearer, mixed with the soft crackle of fire and the occasional call of someone checking on another, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not unease, not exactly, but awareness. The kind that comes when a man realizes he is riding into a place where his presence has weight he has not yet measured. A child's laugh drifted briefly through the air, light and quick, gone almost as soon as it appeared, and it cut through the night sharper than any shout could have, because it did not belong to fear, it belonged to relief, the kind that comes after something has already been survived. The riders slowed as one, their horses easing into a walk, and no one announced their arrival, no one called out, because the camp had already seen them, heads turning, figures pausing, eyes following the line of horses as they approached with a calm that did not need explanation. Ethan shifted slightly in the saddle, his hand resting near the reins, not tightening, not pulling, just there, and Ash responded with the same quiet steadiness, stepping forward into the circle of firelight as if it had never left it. Eliza dismounted first, her boots touching the ground with purpose now, and several people moved toward her, not rushing, not crowding, but drawn by something deeper than curiosity, and she met them without hesitation, her posture changing in a way Ethan had not seen before, no longer the girl asking for something she might not receive, but someone who had returned carrying exactly what was needed. He watched from the saddle for a moment longer, taking in the way the camp held itself together, not strong because it had to be, but strong because it had chosen to be, And when he finally swung his leg over and stepped down onto the ground, the firelight catching the dust on his boots, he realized that no one here looked at him like a stranger, not quite, but not like one of their own either. They looked at him like a man whose choice had already reached them before he did. Somewhere near the center of the camp, a space opened without anyone asking for it. And Eliza turned back toward him, not calling him forward, not signaling, just waiting, because whatever came next was not hers to decide alone. And Ethan Caldwell, standing at the edge of a place he had never meant to find, understood that the night had not ended when he followed. It had only begun to show him why he was meant to arrive. The space they had left open did not close behind him, and that was the first thing Ethan Caldwell noticed as he stepped forward into the heart of the camp, the firelight catching on faces that turned toward him not with suspicion, but with a quiet awareness, as if they had already measured him through the story carried back before he arrived. The air smelled of wood smoke, worn canvas, and something faintly sweet, like dried herbs steeping in warm water, and the ground beneath his boots felt different here, less empty, pressed down by many lives holding their place against a land that rarely allowed it. Eliza Ward stood near the center, speaking softly to an older man whose posture held both weariness and authority, and when she finished, she did not point toward Ethan. She did not explain him. She simply stepped aside again, leaving the truth of his presence to speak for itself. The older man turned then, his eyes steady and clear despite the long miles written into the lines of his face, and he approached without hurry, stopping just a few feet away, close enough to be heard without raising his voice, far enough to leave room for choice. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because whatever needed to be said had already been carried here in a way that did not depend on words. Ethan met his gaze without shifting, not offering his name, not asking for theirs, because out here names mattered less than what a man did when it counted. And the silence stretched just long enough to feel complete before the older man inclined his head slightly, not a bow, not a gesture of submission, but something quieter, something that acknowledged without placing weight where it was not needed. Behind them, the camp moved carefully around its own rhythm, someone tending a small pot over the fire, another adjusting a blanket over a sleeping child, small actions that spoke of endurance rather than comfort. And Ethan's eyes moved across those details, taking them in without judgment, because he had seen enough of the land to know what it took to keep something like this together. Eliza stepped closer again, her voice low as she spoke not to the older man, but to Ethan, explaining just enough for the moment to settle that the riders had been searching for a path through the dry basin before nightfall, that without a horse strong enough to carry her across the distance, the warning would not have reached them in time. And though she did not describe what had nearly been lost, she did not need to, because the presence of these people standing here was proof enough of what had been held onto. Ethan listened, his expression unchanged, but something in the way his shoulders settled told a different story. Not relief exactly, but a quiet recognition that the choice he made had found its place in something larger than himself. The older man watched that understanding pass through him, and then he turned slightly, gesturing toward the fire without insistence, simply opening a space where Ethan could stand if he chose to stay. And the invitation was not spoken, not formal, but clear in the way the camp shifted just enough to include him without pressing him to belong. Ethan Caldwell remained where he was for a moment longer, the reins still resting in his hand, the warmth of the fire brushing against his face, and then he stepped forward into that space, not as a man claiming anything, not as a man asking for anything, but as someone who understood that sometimes a single quiet decision does not end when it is made. It continues, carried forward by others until it becomes something no one person could have shaped alone. The fire did not grow louder when he stepped closer. It simply held its place, steady and patient, the kind of warmth that did not demand attention but made itself known all the same. And Ethan Caldwell stood within its reach now, feeling the difference between watching from the edge and standing inside something that carried the weight of many lives at once. The older man lowered himself beside the flames with the slow care of someone who understood exactly how much strength to spend and how much to keep. And without looking up, he nudged a small tin cup toward an open space near the fire, not offering it directly, not insisting, just placing it where it could be taken if chosen. And Ethan noticed that no one here handed things to him. They simply made room for him to take them. Eliza Ward moved through the camp with quiet purpose, stopping briefly at one wagon where a woman rested with a blanket drawn close, exchanging a few words too soft to carry, then moving on, her presence shifting from one place to another like someone who belonged not to a single moment but to all of them at once. A young boy sat near the fire, watching Ethan with open curiosity, his hands wrapped around a piece of bread he had not yet eaten, and when their eyes met, the boy did not look away, he simply studied him, as if trying to understand how a man he had never seen had somehow arrived carrying a story that reached this far. Ethan lowered himself onto the ground at last, boots angled toward the warmth, the reins coiled loosely in his hand before he set them beside him, not letting go completely, but not holding tight either, and the horse stood a few steps back, head lowered, ears shifting gently as it took in the unfamiliar sounds without alarm. The murmur of the camp continued around them, quiet voices, the soft clink of metal, the shifting of fabric against wood, small sounds that spoke of people holding together through something that had already tested them, and above it all, the night stretched wide, untouched, as if none of this mattered to the sky, yet everything here mattered to the ground. The older man finally spoke then, not to question, not to praise, but to place something simple between them, saying that out here, time is the only thing no one can earn back once it is lost. And he let the words rest there without explanation, trusting that a man who understood the land would understand the meaning. Ethan listened, his gaze drifting toward the edges of the camp where the darkness pressed close, and he thought of the miles Eliza had ridden, the distance measured not in land but in moments that could not be delayed, and he nodded once, not in agreement alone but in recognition. Eliza returned then, stepping into the circle of firelight again, her face softer now, the urgency replaced by something steadier, and she did not sit immediately, she remained standing, looking at Ethan as if there was still one part of the story that had not yet been told. The wind shifted slightly, carrying a cooler edge from beyond the camp, and somewhere in the distance a faint shape moved along the horizon, too far to define, but enough to remind anyone watching that the land did not stay still for long. The boy near the fire finally took a bite of his bread, slow and deliberate, as if savoring something he had not been sure he would have, and Ethan saw that small act for what it was, not just hunger answered, but time given back, and he realized that whatever he had stepped into tonight was not finished, not settled. It was holding its breath again, waiting for something else to arrive, something just beyond the reach of the firelight. The shape on the horizon did not disappear, and that was enough to change the way the air moved through the camp, not with panic, not with fear, but with a quiet tightening that passed from one person to another without a single word needing to carry it. Ethan Caldwell noticed it first in the small things, the way the older man's hand paused just a second longer over the tin cup, the way the boy by the fire stopped chewing and looked out past the wagons, the way Eliza Ward did not turn immediately but held her gaze steady, as if confirming something she had already expected. The wind shifted again, cooler now, carrying with it a faint echo of distant movement, not loud, not urgent, but present in a way that could not be ignored, and the riders who had brought Ethan here did not reach for anything, did not break formation. They simply adjusted their positions slightly, turning their horses just enough to face the direction of that distant shape. The firelight flickered against their silhouettes, steady hands, quiet posture, no rush, because whatever approached had not yet crossed into something that demanded action, only attention. Eliza finally turned then, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the horizon, and when she spoke, her voice carried just far enough for those closest to hear, not a warning, not an alarm, just a statement placed carefully into the night, saying that the land does not forget who travels across it. And Ethan understood that she was not speaking about the camp, she was speaking about whatever was coming toward it. He rose slowly from where he sat, brushing the dust from his coat without hurry, his movements matching the pace of the camp itself, because out here, speed without reason was a mistake men did not make twice. And as he stepped forward, Ash shifted closer behind him, the horse's presence quiet but ready, as if it too recognized that something had changed. The older man stood as well, his posture straightening not with tension but with purpose, and he looked at Ethan for a brief moment, not asking for help, not expecting it, simply acknowledging that the choice made earlier had placed him here now, at the edge of whatever came next. The camp did not scatter, did not hide. It held its shape, wagons forming a loose line, people moving closer together but not crowding, as if they had learned long ago that standing firm often meant more than running. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, the distant figure now slightly clearer, not a single rider, not a group like the one he had followed, but something slower, something measured in a different way, and he felt the weight of the moment settle into place, not heavy enough to press him down, but steady enough to remind him that whatever was approaching would test more than distance or time. Eliza stepped beside him then, not in front, not behind, and for a moment they stood there together, watching the same line where darkness met the last trace of fading light, and she did not speak again, because there was nothing left to explain, only something left to face. The fire crackled softly behind them. The boy resumed his quiet chewing. The riders held their line, and the land stretched wide and silent. As the figure on the horizon moved closer, carrying with it a question that no one in the camp could yet answer, but one that every person there, including Ethan Caldwell, understood they would not turn away from. The figure did not rush as it came closer, and that was the second thing Ethan Caldwell understood about it. The first being that it carried no urgency, and the second that it carried no fear, moving across the open land with the same quiet certainty that had brought him here hours before. And as the distance closed, the shape began to take form, not a rider, not a wagon, but a single horse walking at an unhurried pace, its head low, its steps measured as if guided more by instinct than command. The camp held still, not frozen, but grounded, every movement reduced to what mattered, and Eliza Ward took one step forward, just enough to stand clear of the others, her eyes fixed on the approaching animal, as if she already knew what it would bring with it. The wind carried a soft sound then, not words, not a call, but something lighter, a faint rhythm that did not belong to hooves or leather. And as the horse drew near the edge of the firelight, the truth revealed itself without announcement. A small figure seated in the saddle, wrapped in a blanket too large for their frame, hands resting loosely, not gripping, not guiding, simply being carried. Ethan's breath slowed, not in surprise, but in recognition of something deeper than what could be seen at a glance, and the older man stepped forward now, his movement careful, deliberate, as if approaching not a stranger but something that needed to be met without suddenness. The horse stopped on its own, just beyond the reach of the fire, and the small figure shifted slightly, the blanket falling back just enough to reveal a child's face, eyes open, steady, not frightened, not confused, simply watching the people gathered before them as if they had been expected all along. Eliza moved closer, her voice soft as she spoke the child's name, a name that carried through the air like something fragile and strong at the same time, and the child looked at her, not with relief alone, but with trust, the kind that does not come easily, the kind that has already been tested and held. Ethan stood where he was, his hand resting lightly against Ash's neck, and in that moment he understood what the distant shape had always been, not a threat, not a question, but an answer arriving at its own pace, carried across miles not by speed but by certainty. The camp shifted then, not breaking its stillness but reshaping it, people stepping forward, not crowding, not rushing, creating space around the horse and its rider, allowing the moment to unfold without pressure, and the older man reached out slowly, offering his hand not to take, not to pull, but to steady, to guide if needed. The child did not resist, did not hesitate, simply allowed the motion to happen, sliding gently from the saddle into waiting arms, the blanket settling around them again as if nothing had been disturbed. Eliza exhaled softly, a breath that seemed to carry hours with it, and she turned slightly, her gaze finding Ethan for just a second, not to explain, not to thank, but to share the understanding that what had been set in motion earlier had reached further than either of them had known. The fire crackled behind them. The night remained wide and still, and Ethan Caldwell, standing at the edge of that quiet circle, realized that the horse he had given away had not only carried someone across the land, it had carried something back, something that no one there had been certain they would see again, and the weight of that return settled into the silence, not loud, not overwhelming, but undeniable in a way that needed no words at all. No one spoke when the child's feet touched the ground, and that silence carried more weight than any cheer or cry ever could, because it was not empty. It was full, filled with the quiet understanding of something returned that had once been uncertain. The older man held the child only long enough to steady them before easing back, not keeping them close, not claiming anything, simply making sure they stood on their own, and the child did, small but steady, blanket wrapped around their shoulders, eyes moving across the faces gathered there as if counting something that had been missing before. Eliza Ward knelt slightly, bringing herself level with the child, her voice low and gentle as she spoke again. And though the words did not carry far, the tone did, soft but certain, like someone placing the final piece into a place that had been waiting. The child reached out then, not toward her first, but past her, small hand extending toward the open space where Ethan Caldwell stood, and for a moment no one moved. Because the gesture was simple but unexpected, crossing a line that had not been drawn yet somehow understood. Ethan did not hesitate. Not this time. He stepped forward, boots quiet against the packed earth, and when he reached them, he lowered himself slightly, not towering, not distant, but present in a way that matched the moment, and the child's hand met his, light but sure, fingers closing around his as if they already knew the shape of it. There was no fear in that touch, no question, only recognition, and Ethan felt it without needing to name it. The same quiet certainty that had guided him when he gave the horse, the same stillness that had followed him across the land, now settling into something he could finally see. Behind them, the riders who had brought him here began to dismount one by one, their movements unhurried, deliberate, and as their boots met the ground, they did not step forward, they did not gather close, they simply stood, forming a loose circle that held the moment without closing it in. The firelight caught their faces, revealing not tension, not pride, but something steadier, something that belonged to people who had seen enough of the land to understand what it meant when something returned against the odds. The older man watched the exchange without interruption, his gaze moving from the child to Ethan, then to Eliza, and in that quiet observation there was a kind of acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken, a recognition that the thread connecting them had been tied long before any of them stood here tonight. Eliza rose slowly, stepping back just enough to leave the space open between them, and for the first time since she had appeared on that road, there was nothing urgent in her posture, nothing unresolved, only a calm that came from knowing something had reached its end the way it was meant to. The child released Ethan's hand after a moment, not pulling away, just letting go as naturally as they had reached out, and turned slightly toward the older man, who nodded once, a small motion that carried both relief and responsibility. The camp breathed again then, not louder, not faster, just easier, as if something held tight had finally loosened, and Ethan Caldwell, standing there with the faint warmth of that small hand still lingering in his own, understood that what had come back across the miles was not only a life, but a trust placed without words, and that kind of return did not end with the moment. It stayed, quiet and steady, long after the fire burned low. The camp did not celebrate, and that was what made the moment feel complete, because out here people who lived close to the edge understood that what mattered most did not need noise to prove it, and Ethan Caldwell stood just outside the circle of firelight now, watching as the night slowly returned to its steady rhythm. The child guided gently toward a wagon where a woman waited with quiet hands, the older man speaking in low tones to those nearest him, and Eliza Ward moving once more through the spaces between people, not as someone carrying urgency, but as someone who had already delivered it. The riders who had formed that silent line began to tend to their horses, loosening straps, checking hooves, small tasks done with care, and though no one gathered around Ethan, no one turned away from him either. They simply allowed him to remain, a presence acknowledged without being pressed into place. He rested, his hand against ash again, feeling the slow, steady breath of the animal beneath his palm, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in recognition, because what had unfolded here was not something he had chased, not something he had planned. It had found him in the quiet space where he had chosen to give without asking. The fire cracked softly, sparks lifting into the dark before fading, And Ethan opened his eyes to see Eliza standing a few steps away, her posture calm, her gaze clear, and when she spoke this time, there was no weight left in it, no urgency, only truth placed gently between them, saying that not everything carried across the land returns the same way it left, and sometimes what comes back is not meant to be kept. Ethan studied her for a moment, the words settling slowly, and he understood that she was not speaking about the horse, not really. She was speaking about something deeper, something that had passed through both of them and changed shape. Along the way, he nodded once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, simply acknowledging that he had heard, and that was enough. The older man approached again, stopping beside Eliza, his eyes moving briefly between them before resting on Ethan, and without raising his voice, without ceremony, he spoke a single sentence that carried the quiet weight of everything that had happened, saying that a man who gives without asking often receives without expecting, and then he stepped back, leaving the words where they belonged, not demanding response, not seeking approval. The camp continued around them, a child's soft voice, the rustle of canvas, the low murmur of conversation returning in pieces, and Ethan realized that the moment had already passed, not lost, but completed, like something that had reached exactly where it needed to be and no further. He picked up the reins loosely, not tightening his grip, not preparing to leave just yet, but no longer holding them like a man who might lose them again, and Ash shifted beside him, calm, ready, as if the distance ahead no longer held the same weight it once had. Eliza turned slightly, her attention already moving back toward the people who needed her, and for the first time since she had stepped into his path, she did not look back, not because she had forgotten him, but because she no longer needed to. And Ethan Caldwell, standing there at the edge of the firelight, understood that whatever had been given on that empty road had not ended here. It had simply taken a form that did not belong to him anymore, and that was enough to let it go without regret. The fire burned lower as the night stretched on, not fading, just settling into a quieter glow, the kind that does not demand attention but stays long enough to remind you it was there. And Ethan Caldwell stood beside his horse for a moment longer, feeling the stillness return to the land in a way that felt different now, not empty, not distant, but full in a way he could not measure with miles or time. No one stopped him when he reached for the saddle. No one asked where he would go next. Because out here a man's path belonged to him the same way the land belonged to no one. And as he pulled himself up into the seat, the leather creaking softly beneath him, it felt familiar again, but not the same, not exactly. Ash shifted beneath him, steady and patient, and Ethan turned the horse slightly away from the firelight, the camp behind him continuing without pause, without ceremony. Because what had happened did not need to be held onto to be real. It simply became part of the ground. They stood on. Eliza Ward did not call out to him, did not step forward, but as he guided the horse into motion, she paused where she stood, her gaze following him just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, not gratitude, not farewell, something quieter than both, something that did not ask to be remembered because it already would be. The older man inclined his head once more, not toward Ethan directly, but toward the space he had occupied, as if acknowledging the absence that would remain after he left, and the child, now seated near the wagon, looked up briefly, eyes steady, watching the man who had never spoken a promise yet had kept one all the same. The sound of hooves carried softly across the ground as Ethan rode out beyond the reach of the fire, the light shrinking behind him until it became just another glow against the dark, one of many that dotted the wide stretch of land. And ahead, the horizon opened again, endless and quiet, waiting without expectation. He did not look back, not because he chose not to, but because there was nothing behind him that needed checking, nothing unfinished, nothing left undone, and the reins rested loose in his hands, not held tight, not pulled, just guided, the way a man moves when he no longer needs to measure every step. The wind moved across the plains, carrying faint traces of smoke, of voices, of something that would fade with distance but not disappear completely, and Ethan rode through it without slowing, without chasing, because he understood now that some things are not meant to be kept, only passed through. The stars above remained sharp and distant, unchanged by anything that had happened below. And yet the ground beneath him felt different, not because the land had shifted, but because he had, somewhere behind him, a child would sleep through the night that